Hey, YouTube and Instagram, it's Gordon Miller. Let me adjust the height of this here. All right. Well, it's Gordon Miller, and welcome to Live at 5, The Truth Unfiltered. Today's topic was going to be done on Friday, and it was going to be about politics in the United States and systemic racism. The I had a lot of requests over the weekend from people who were even hijacking my Sunday morning breakfast feed to say, hey, you need to say something. It's like, dude, I already have it scheduled to say something, but after yesterday's blackout on Tuesday, I figured it was probably worth my next real post being about racism. And there are a couple things that are important to kind of understand. Um, and and so I am here in the United States. I was born in Virginia, and Virginia, unfortunately, has the distinction of being the first settlement in the New World, 1607 at Jamestown. The trouble is, all those Plymouth Rock people think that everything happened much later, but unfortunately, you know, uh, the first settlers to the New World were at Jamestown in Virginia. Jamestown is about an hour and a half away. And so the very first settlement in the New World um, by Western Europeans was in 1607. And so it's important to have a little bit of context for that. So Virginia, uh, was bringing uh, people over in terms of new settlers. 1607, I believe there was another resupply ship in 1608, 1610, something like that. My family, according to my grandmother's genealogy work and things like that, my family came over in 1618. So about 9 years after the first settlement, I think on the third or fourth ship. My ancestry is from Scotland and parts of Germany. Those people from Germany migrated to Scotland, and from Scotland they migrated to the New World. And so the way that Virginia, in a way, Virginia is the source of where the oldest pieces in the New World really are, oldest settlements. Oldest seat of government, Williamsburg, was here in Virginia, about an hour away. Was the very first seat of government before being moved to Washington, D.C. And so here in Virginia, it holds a lot of historical significance. So I was unfortunately not, I didn't look this up beforehand, but the first slave ships to the New World came over, I believe, in 1619. I will have to verify that, and I'll post in the description if I got that wrong. So, the very first group, there were no slaves, and the settlers, about half of the first settlers in 1607 died. The resupply ship, I think, took until 1612 to get the resupplies. And like I said, my family came over in 1618, and by 1619, I believe it was, is when they started bringing over slaves. Now, slavery was very popular in Europe. I mean, slavery has been popular for 6,000 years. I mean, if you look at the reality of slavery, the Egyptians enslaved the Jews. And if you look at, like the book of Exodus, it's about the Jews escaping captivity. You look at the fact that, I mean, Judaism is, 5,800 years old, and, the Old Testament stuff, I don't recall what the specific dates are, but it certainly precedes, the year of Christ. So we're talking about slavery being a reality just in terms of societal reality for much of the last 6,000 years or more. If you take a look at how slavery was implemented, typically people became slaves when they were conquered, and they would press captured individuals into service and things like that. So, but that's different than what we're talking about. We're talking about the history of racism, at least in the United States. And so, and slavery has a long history, almost 400 years, in terms of, or over 400 years, from 1619 to 16 I'm sorry, from 1619 to 1865 is what, 240 years or something like that. So the so there's a long tradition up until the U.S. Civil War of slavery, and the founders of the Constitution here in the United States, the founding fathers, if you will, all frankly a bunch of religious white guys. They they were debating on whether or not slavery they should whether they should abolish slavery or not. And so the and so the issue that they ultimately focused on was they thought that it was going to be too difficult from a sociological or societal standpoint to abolish slavery at the founding of the Constitution. Otherwise, our Constitution would have abolished slavery. And so I think that if you look back at the conversations that went on, it was because there was a largely agrarian society. They were mostly farmers, and they needed to manage, thousands of acres of farmland that made food that fed everybody in the country. And so I think that there was not a great deal of support in areas where you had highly dense agrarian societies in 1776 in order to be able to abolish slavery, and that's unfortunate, because I think that if we had abolished slavery and we realized that we could have hired a workforce that made sense and put people to work, then I think that things would have been vastly different. And so I'm not faulting the founding fathers for it, but you have to understand that you have a bunch of quasi-religious white guys that are making the decision for everybody. Now, at that time, women didn't have rights at all. So women were property, and people of color were property, and so that doesn't make any of that right. And it took women an enormous amount of time through the suffrage movement to even get the right to vote. And so you take a look at early society, and so it's one of those kind of things that I think it's important that as we moved from an agrarian society to an industrialized society at the turn of the century, to now a knowledge economy and a bunch of other things. Now we even have a global economy on our hands. And I think that it's important that everybody truly understand the reality of the role that sort of systemic racism plays in the modern world. Now, I grew up, fast forward to 1865 or 1860 to 1865 during the Civil War. Richmond, Virginia, right here where I am, was the capital of the Confederacy. So basically the 13 states that didn't want to abolish slavery, that wanted to continue to have their largely agrarian societies run by slave labor to benefit the landowners. And northern states were where large cities like Boston and New York and other places like that were. And they were fine with abolishing slavery because their stuff didn't work on slavery. So the reality is that not a great deal of progress was made after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation happened. There was not a great deal of progress immediately following that. People still needed something to do. They needed a way to make a living. And so even paying people to do the work that they had been doing before, that's where we get the idea of slave wages coming from. If you're paying somebody a relatively low amount and that isn't really a living wage, it's not a whole lot better than slavery back in the day. So now that was 1865. Well, I was born in 1964, and so in the 100 years between the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, and the beginning of my life, there was not a great deal of social progress that was made. It's unfortunate. I mean, here in the United States, we still had separation of whites and blacks into schools and neighborhoods, and even special restaurants and things like that that had black and white sections and things like that. So it was a real consideration in terms of the fact that separate but equal was certainly separate, but in no way equal. And as they began to look at ways of adopting strategies towards integration, integration was the idea that you take kids from black neighborhoods and you would bus them to white neighborhoods to go to school, and you would take white kids from white neighborhoods and bus them to black neighborhoods. And I think that the idea behind integration was, I think, a good overall idea. But of course, the neighborhoods were still divided into black and white neighborhoods, so it was difficult to, you get the kids on the bus, a long time. And there were things going on during the civil rights movement that, also that were at odds, and there was tension, with two different strategies. Now, I happen to be a huge Malcolm X fan. And so Malcolm X had found what I think was really kind of the real path. I mean, he largely gets criticized for being way too militant, and perhaps that's true. Now, if you look at the history of the National Rifle Association, the NRA, was actually created to keep weapons out of the hands of black people. The idea was that despite the Second Amendment, they didn't want a group of armed citizens in the black communities to be armed. And so the NRA was originally designed to try and help minimize the overall spread of the use of firearms and arming the black community, which I think is reprehensible. It's no better than the folks that started some of the other movements behind the abortion clinics and things like that. The founder for Planned Parenthood acknowledged that it was primarily for control of the population in the black community, and I think that's horrible. I mean, that those are facts, and there are quotes by those people and that founded those organizations that were largely racist. I mean, out and outwardly racist, and it's it was a very difficult time period in the 60s. And so I was born in November of 1964, and about a year after President Kennedy was assassinated. And so there are lots of reasons behind why President Kennedy was likely assassinated, but the from what I understand, one of the more popular theories is the fact that they weren't going to adopt, he wasn't going to adopt some of the civil rights legislation that was being proposed. And the problem is that nobody could really agree on what the right strategy was. But after his death, Vice President Johnson, who became president after the president was killed, one of the very first things they did was move through the civil rights legislation, and which I think is great. But the problem is that the legal progress that we had back then was not enough because of the societal constructs around which that had been built up for literally 400 years. I mean, from 1607 to 1967, you've got 300 plus years worth of systemic racism, and so you're not going to unseat that kind of systemic racism overnight. And integration was fraught with all sorts of other issues, but I think all of the efforts during the civil rights movement of the 1960s was necessary and valid. Some of it was nonviolent protests. Some of it was violent protests, like what we've seen here recently. And I happen to believe that Malcolm X, who was working with members of the Black Panthers, they had a range of social programs in New York City that was working. Malcolm had said, "Look, we're gonna just take a page from the white neighborhood playbooks, and the white man's got his banks and his businesses and his neighborhoods. We're going to have black businesses and black neighborhoods and black banks and support what's going on in the black community." And I think I think it was working. If you look at the 68 social programs, which is enumerated on Wikipedia, you can look it up. That the programs that Malcolm X was implementing at the local level was working. And that was a serious problem to the political machine. And I'm not going to take sides here I'm not going to point fingers at the founders of the Ku Klux Klan were Democrats, and I'm not going to talk about Republicans or Democrats in today's terms, or how the ideology's flipped. I'm not going to get into a political debate on which is better. Both sides are culpable, and that's the problem. That's the part that we have to look at. So, and I think that, having grown up around this, I'm 55 now, so I'll be 56 later this year. And I've been thinking the last week on how I was going to do this particular broadcast. And first of all, I was mad as fuck when I started out, because I was just going to, and mad for probably reasons that you don't think. So, the thing for me is that, rather than being like, lose it, it could, this is my first drink of the day. So, I would have, rather than like drink all day long and come on like half hammered and just go off on everybody, then, that would probably be made for a fun video, but I don't think it would have achieved the result. So what I wanted to do was share with you, what my experience has been. So I was born in 1964, and by the time there was no kindergarten, where when I was growing up in the 60s. Kindergarten was a later thing that they added. You had preschool, that was essentially what they called like fourth and fifth year kindergarten, and you went to first grade at age 6. So by the time I was 6, that would be 1969 to 1970. We were in the middle of the issue of integration and trying to work through that. And I did my first year of school in first grade at a public school. I went to a religious preschool, Baptist, Southern Baptist actually. And so, I grew up my parents were both born in the 30s, my mother in 1936 and my father in 1938. They grew up as teenagers and young adults in the 1950s. Well, the 1950s in the United States, 57, 56, 57, 58, probably the height of what I would consider absolutely appalling racism in the United States. It was, and that environment that they grew up in impacted their view on the world. Now, I'm not gonna accuse my parents of being racist. That's my mom's actually watching, and I'm not gonna not do that because she's watching. I don't think my parents are necessarily racist. I think that it is the social construct and that everybody grew up in those days that ended up with that being the way that people in that generation saw the world. And so I think that it's important to make that distinction. I think it's important to understand that good people grew up in a bad situation, and I think that also there were bad people that grew up in a bad situation, and they used that as an excuse to misbehave and to treat other people poorly. By the time the 60s rolled around, 70s, when I was in elementary school, I don't recall any time when there was ever any news of any lynchings in Richmond, Virginia here. I don't remember anybody hanging from any trees in our neighborhood or any other neighborhood. But that shit happened for real in the 1950s. You can't grow up in an environment like that and not be affected by it, regardless in the 1950s if you're a good person or a bad person. You have a bad social construct in which you're growing up in. And so, ironically, when integration started in Virginia, and I was going to be bused to the other side of town to as part of integration, my parents said they didn't want me to spend 45 minutes on the bus each way each day and things like that. So they decided to put me in private school. Now, you can say that they decided to put me in private school because at second grade, because they were racist and they didn't want me, having black friends. But as you'll see in a minute, that's just simply not the case. So I know that we made decisions here about where to live, where if we ended up living close to the schools that the kids would go to, because we also didn't want the kids to be on the bus for 30 or 45 minutes a day. And so now the kids can walk home and things like that. So I'll take my parents at their word and say their motivation was not motivated by racism, but motivated by the fact that, it was a lot of time to spend on the bus and, things like that. So, but the ironic part about that is that the kids that I grew up with and went to school with in private school, they were from more wealthier families. Of course, here in Richmond, there were a number of wealthy African American families, and they also decided to send their kids to private schools. So, which is so funny because it ended up being that. A majority of my good friends, I had two really good friends that lived in my neighborhood, and I went to school with them as well. And then I had two really good friends that were black that lived in another neighborhood. But one is the son of the first black judge here in Richmond, Virginia, Judge Douglas, and his son Doug. And so Dougie and I were great friends, and I recall my parents encouraging me to judge my friends based on the quality of their character and not the color of their skin. And it wasn't until later that I realized that those are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so again, that's the way we raised our kids, but things are different now than they were way back then. We were in the middle of the civil rights, era, and Vietnam, and a bunch of other issues that were affecting the way in which society was evolving. And so, but I had tremendous friends. I enjoyed my friends regardless of their color. It was not an issue for me. And and I'm not some white guy saying, hey, I had black friends. I had friends, and the color of their skin, I had Hispanic friends and Asian friends and African American friends, and I had white friends. And the great thing is that I had really good friends, and I really enjoyed those relationships. And but as we grew up, and as I started having my own kids at age 35, so 20 years ago, my oldest son is 20, and my wife and I started talking about what kind of world we wanted to bring our kids up in, and so we had a very serious talk about that. And it come to find out, one of her good friends early on, my wife's from Pennsylvania, and one of her good friends early on was black. And so unfortunately, she was kind of ridiculed and shunned for that, even north of the Mason-Dixon line, where traditionally northern families haven't had, that kind of problem with racism. So, it's unfortunate, but that was the kind of, the way that things were in the 60s and 70s. And as it went to the 80s, I didn't recall it being as bad. Things certainly got better, and then in the 80s and 90s, things seemed to improve. And as we continue to see people of color being represented in various capacities in society, I remember when I was working at the State Department in 2004, I was working at the time when Colin Powell was Secretary of State, one of the most amazing men I've ever met, and one of the most amazing people to work for. And when he resigned, Condoleezza Rice came in, and another amazing woman, just absolutely just unbelievable at their job as Secretary of State. And regardless of their political affiliations, regardless of the color of their skin, they were just amazing people. And the 3 years that I spent from 2004 to 2006 working at the State Department were three of the best years of my life. I mean, I really enjoyed the opportunity to see people of color taking key positions. And of course, when President Barack Obama was elected in 2008, the opportunity to really see major change kind of occur was, especially since it was a platform of hope and change, then I was really kind of hoping for there to be some additional progress, I guess. And so it's interesting. I'll digress for a minute. So my oldest son was probably what, 5 maybe. I think he was probably 5, and he went to private school for the uh, first few years, and then decided to go to the local school here. But his best friend up the street was I just happened to be black, and so it was one of those kind of things where where he comes home one day and he asks my wife and I, he's like, do you know Avery's black? We're like, uh, yeah, it's we understand, we know he's black, and we're just sorry you do. And because we just never made an issue of it. And when you start getting into school, then people start talking about things, and you don't grow up. I mean, you aren't born, hating people. You learn that, and that's part of your societal construct. And so the problem is that we have a society that continues to perpetuate other types of racial issues and continuing to make this a problem. And so for me, one of the things that I was hoping would happen is that when President Obama was elected in '08, I was hoping that we would see some significant progress. And there were a lot of things that were attempted, and you can, hey Hicks, if you don't behave yourself, I'm gonna ban you from the channel. Okay, thank you very much. So it's one of those kind of things that if you know, see, now I lost my train of thought. Fuck you, Hicks. The But the problem is that we didn't see the kind of cooperation in terms of solving some of these social and political issues during President Obama's term. And so now you can argue that it was because of Congress or it's because of whatever. At one point, the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, the presidency, and everything else. So it was, it's one of those kind of things where I was I was hoping that we would see lasting change, and I guess the thing that really kind of affected me the most during Obama's presidency. I was not a huge fan of Obama. I didn't vote for him. I didn't like his policies or much of what he had to say. Mm. But he was a very effective communicator. I was never a birther kind of guy of show me your birth certificate, but because that didn't matter. He was elected to be president. He was a Harvard educated, very well spoken gentleman, and I think he did a great service to the office of the presidency. He was married, had a great relationship with his wife, has two wonderful daughters, and I had the utmost respect for how he conducted himself while president. And while I didn't agree with him all the time, I did believe that it was an opportunity to be able to support the office of the president, hoping that we would see some lasting and enduring change. Now, it's interesting. So for those of you who don't know this, you can look it up. You can Google it. I read both of Obama's books, Dreams from My Father, and one of the other books. I forget the other title of the other one. But I read Obama's book, and I also read Michelle Obama's thesis or dissertation or whatever it is that talks about the issue that she was kind of wrestling with was the issue of what if you ascended to a place of power or authority and yet chose not to help. Now, I don't think that the Obamas chose not to help the cause. I just think that it was an interesting. It's interesting that Michelle Obama had spent some time thinking about the fact that that it was possible that the system itself, the fundamental construct of the system itself, was something that was inherently not working. And it wouldn't necessarily matter who was president. Or, it wasn't just a matter that, okay, well, we had the first African American president. And of course, some people say, well, he was like half white. Okay, well, gosh, I guess we're still waiting for our first full African American president. Good Lord, give me a break, people. Come on, and it's just things like that, it's like we're going to draw a distinction, and things like that. But if you read Michelle Obama's dissertation, it's actually really pretty interesting. And I find it compelling in a number of ways. The idea that you get so high up in a fundamental hierarchy that you have the power to control something, but you aren't able to do the things that you want to do because of the nature of the construct. And it's a very compelling argument. It really is. And so when people talk about, oh, this is an isolated incident. Why are people rioting in 50 cities? Why do we have all this, this stuff going on? Why can't the black community be happy? They had a black president, for God's sake. What the hell? You hear shit like that all the time, and it annoys me to no end. But I tell you what, I certainly celebrated when President Obama left, thinking that if we had somebody in office that was going to, make fundamental changes into the system, even if you had to tear it down or destroy the system. Because, again, President Trump ran on the drain the swamp, platform. He on the 22 trillion is too much. We can't afford this. We need to renegotiate our deals with our trade deals, and we need to do this and do that. Well, so for me, as a reformed Trump supporter, everybody who voted for Trump should have buyer's remorse right about now, and I'm going to give you a couple of really cogent reasons why that is. So the reason is that, I thought that bringing in a business guy like Trump was going to use logic and was going to reform the financial and fundamental constructs that would have been beneficial to everybody. And initially, in the first couple of years, that we began to see that. We saw, the stock market going out of control, 50% higher than it was when he took office. We saw the lowest Hispanic and African American unemployment rates that we've ever seen, and I don't know when. We were at 3% unemployment or something like that. And we're seeing some amazing financial progress, and so or so it seemed, and so again, I'm reminded that I thought Trump was a billionaire businessman who's going to make some decent choices, and unfortunately, I'm reminded constantly by some of my friends that Trump is first and foremost a showman, not too different from Barnum and Bailey that were the circus founders, and so the Ringling Brothers were great at putting on a show. Well, Trump is really good at putting on a show. Um, Unfortunately, you know, he's a reality TV show star, and the show did really well, and so he was able to translate that popularity and he has some really smart people working for him on the election side. But I'll predict right now that there's no way in hell President Trump will ever get reelected. Which puts him on the, in the same boat as Jimmy Carter. If you can imagine that, Jimmy was a one-term president because they were like, "Oh shit, we can't afford a mistake like that again." And for me, um, it's one of those kind of things where I really um, I really wish that we had a real commander in chief, a real leader. And I'm so disappointed at the lack of leadership. And let me just kind of provide a couple of context. So first of all, I mean racism is rampant in the U.S. and I'm not down on law enforcement. If you look on my website at g3.com, we've done work with, in energy and healthcare and law enforcement and defense, aviation, and things like that. So I think that law enforcement is necessary, and I think that largely law enforcement does a decent job. Um, you know, are there people in law enforcement that are bad people? Sure, yeah. Just like I was talking about before about a social construct with good people growing up in a bad situation or bad people in a bad situation, they're going to take advantage of that to forward their own agenda. So, it's one of those kind of things that um, and I think that clearly, I mean, obviously, while there may have been, and this is the thing that I also kind of dislike. I dislike the fact that everybody wants to armchair quarterback this thing, and they want to do a frame by frame analysis of, okay, well, he was cooperative at first when they took him out of his car and they walked him across the street, and they're putting him in the SUV, and then he got into a scuffle with police, and it's clearly a scene on the video and things like that. None of that matters. I mean, yes, he was resisting arrest. It appears that that is the case at one point, and then they took him to the ground, and he's handcuffed. He's not resisting anymore, and so George Floyd was no harm. There was no threat to anybody. George is a huge guy, and certainly he has a history. He has a criminal record. He served 5 years on a negotiated deal for breaking and entering. But none of that matters. I mean, he would have served 12 years. He did 5 on a plea deal. But his criminal record, his criminal history, it doesn't matter. And the forgery charge that he was being faced with was for passing a fake $20 bill. And some people have said it's a fake check. I understand it's a fake $20 bill, but it doesn't matter. You know, it's a $20 charge. He's passing a $20 financial instrument, and it's a misdemeanor at best. So, there's no reason to treat anybody. It doesn't matter this color of their skin, but it doesn't make any sense to treat anybody that way. And the officer who pinned George Floyd to the ground, excuse me, for close to 9 minutes. That tactic, first of all, if you're going to put a knee on somebody, it's in the middle of their back, not on their neck, and things like that. And the other thing is, people keep commenting, well, why did the other cops, stop it? And I understand today the other cops were charged with as an accessory to commit murder or something like that. And I think that's kind of a shame, for some part. Because as I understand, the offending officer was the ranking officer on the scene, and so the other junior officers were not really in a position to second guess the leadership, but they should have said something and they should have done something, and I agree with that. I mean, clearly, I think they're going to have a hard time proving that that was a crime because they weren't. I don't know that they were complicit in it. So again, what you can charge somebody with, and what you can prove, and what you can convict them of, is two different things. So there's another thing too that um, you know it's one of those things too that for me, um, there's another bit of the autopsy which came out, which the family has hired their own person to do the autopsy, and so so the issue for me is that apparently when the ambulance came to take him, the um, the paramedic administered a heavy dose of a sedative so they wouldn't have any trouble with him resisting trying to get him transported. And I think it's going to come out at trial, unfortunately, that it was an underlying medical condition as well as the injection that was administered by paramedics that killed him. So at best, it's malpractice, which is unfortunate because I think then we're going to see sort of justice denied as the result, and the black community is not going to get the justice that they're seeking in this particular case. I mean, that's just my prediction for the way that the facts may end up, coming together. Certainly, the cop was wrong for doing it. There was no damage to, his throat or any of other vital organs for that. He wasn't. There's no sign of asphyxiation, so he was alive when he got to the hospital. So, I mean, I just think that while everybody wants, to deal with the details. Everybody wants a pass or an out because of some of the details. I think that that's not going to be sufficient for the community as a whole. And I think that the real issue that we have to deal with here is why was Mr. Floyd on the ground for 9 minutes with a police officer with his knee on his neck. And, regardless of the contribution of it to his death or not, the reality is that we even joked some time ago about letting a buddy of mine borrow my Bentley when I had my Bentley and drive down the main street here from the far western edge of town here to the far eastern edge of town down the same road. And we were, joking at first about how long we felt he would make it with the top down as a black man driving a Bentley down the middle of the street and down the road. And so, but that reality is a reality that people end up dealing with every day. People are stopped all the time, and it's just not right. I mean, there are more opportunities for people of color to be involved in incidents with the police because the police are actively seeking out opportunities to stop them. And so, I think it's unfortunate that we have not really progressed much since then. I think that there's, in the 60s and 70s, there was serious systemic racism. I mean, the N word was used, frequently in Virginia, especially here in Richmond, and people were still, insensitive to the needs for us all to figure out what the right solution is. I'm certainly enjoying the conversation that's happening between police and the communities as a whole, and certainly the African American politicians that are mayors or governors of various cities and states and things like that. I like the mayor of Atlanta. When she was like, "Look, you guys got to stop rioting and looting and things like that. Peaceful protest is." Is what we should be doing, and it distracts from the message. Well, I don't happen to necessarily agree with that. I mean, I think that while a lot of this stuff is largely, made up of instigators rather than protesters, I think there are people that are, being shipped in to help, instigate, these kind of riots and initiate looting and stuff like that. And other people have joined in, but that doesn't even matter. I mean, I think it's just a point where we have to look at the facts, and the facts is that we have continued to create a divide, And the problem is with for me is that this president has that we have right now, President Donald John Trump, has done nothing but continue to drive the division between people. He did it when when he got during the election cycle in 2016, and he's continuing to do it today. The thing that really was the final straw for me, and there's lots of stuff that he said and tweeted and things like that. Somebody should take away his phone. But for me, the thing that really was like the last straw for me was the other day when he is deciding that some moron in his political advisor group decides, hey, let's do a photo op at the St. John's Church across the street from the White House. And somebody got a Bible around here, I don't know. So, the so here's my Bible. My Bible's right here. And so, they're going to take the opportunity to clear the streets of nonviolent protesters in front of the White House so the president can cross the street for a photo op. And if you take a look at the history of the White House is referred to as the people's house. And until like 100 years ago, anybody could actually go into the White House. There's no gate or no fence around it, no armed guards. People could walk in and out. And it was largely that way for a long time. So the idea of not only keeping people at bay, but actually scattering protesters with rubber bullets and with tear gas and mace. It's the Capitol Police that were involved with that. I can't watch that video. It after all that everybody's been through, and there were black and white protesters in the crowd, and it's ridiculous that that would happen to anybody. But they were an equal opportunity offender that day. They beat down people regardless of what color it is. But people lost their footing. They fell behind the lines, and the cops beat the shit out of people that were trying to get up and get out of the way. I mean, what kind of fucking America are we got here? I mean, this is absurd. I mean, it is the most unrealistic, absurd piece of film footage I've ever seen in my 55 years. And I can't stand it. That video footage is all that President Biden needs to win the election. I mean, and he gets over there and he's going to go, he's like, he holds the thing up like this, and it's like he's holding a box of tampons that he bought for his wife at the supermarket. Oh, I don't know, I'm holding it up. And somebody asked, is that your Bible? And he goes, it's a Bible. And so I love that, man. I love how fucking stupid that is. So, it is one of those kind of things that, this Bible has been in my family for quite some time. And I hold it with reverence, like I hold something, not, okay, it's a Bible. It's a Bible. Like, are you fucking kidding me? God damn. I mean, are we seriously gonna put up with this asshole as our president for the next 4 years? I mean, are we really gonna do that? I mean, that was just bullshit. I mean, you disrupt a crowd who is peacefully protesting, and you make the police turn it into a riot just so you can get a photo op in front of a boarded up church, holding a Bible that you probably didn't have until just 5 minutes before the photo op. I mean, I don't see you carrying it across the street, President Trump. Somebody handed it to you once your fat dumbass got there. I just don't understand. I am at a loss. And regardless of what this president thinks his IQ is, uh, you know, uh, he is not a very effective communicator. He can certainly read stuff off of a script or a teleprompter, but it's unbelievable to me that we let this moron, literally a moron. I mean, look up the fucking definition of the word. We let this moron become president. I mean, it is beyond me how much harm this one person has done just because the only thing he cares about right now is getting reelected. He won't even wear a mask in public. So, it's one of those things that, Biden is being photographed wearing a mask in public and is even meeting with protesters, like literally feet away from him. What we should have had is President Trump, if he knew what he was doing, if he really cared, he would have addressed the crowd. He would have begun to ask people to allow him to cross the street and had everybody get out of the way, do his thing, and so on. But he's too afraid. He's too afraid of what might happen. So he had them clear the streets and had them hold the perimeter so he could do his photo op. It is unbelievable to me. And now he's threatening that if the other states don't get their shit together and control the riots in their cities, he's going to send in the U.S. military. Well, I got news for you. The Insurrection Act would require the consent of the governor anyway, unless you're going to unless you're going to increase your resume from dictator to authoritative dictator. But, I mean, come on. I mean, you're really going to send military troops? I mean, we already have the National Guard for these states there. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, you're really going to send, and if it's a hollow threat, why threaten the American people? I mean, if it's a hollow threat and you're just a coward, like everybody gives you credit for, then why would you threaten the American people? And you better be ready to send the troops in if that were the case. But I just think that, we are not being well served in terms of leadership. We didn't act fast enough for the coronavirus. We should either have been locked down like everybody else quickly, like they did in Italy and Spain and in China and other places like that. So, he was hoping to run off of a great economy and off of the lowest unemployment for blacks and Hispanics in history and things like that. How's that working for you now, Mr. President? I mean, you really honestly thought that things were just going to hum along. You thought that karma or fate wasn't going to just fuck you in the ass. I mean, come on, give me a break. I mean, are you really that stupid or that narcissistic or that naive? I mean, come on. I largely blame you for, the 40 million people unemployed because they're quote unquote non-essential. You're going to tell people that they have to stay inside for 3 months, that they can't work to feed their families, which most everybody is working out there in the Hispanic and African American communities and parts of the white community and places like that, paycheck to paycheck. And so we're just going to do without like 6 paychecks in a row, 8 paychecks, no problem. We're going to send you $1,200. Hope it helps. That's bullshit. You're going to tell people they're not essential, and then you're going to force them to stay inside. And then when social injustice, continues to be an issue, you're just going to wonder what in the hell happened to your utopia that you created. Honestly, I don't know what in the hell you're thinking. You talk like a retarded sixth grader too. I mean, I don't understand how in the world you ever got to become president. Right now, I would take anybody, literally anybody. I had said this the other day. If Bobo the chimp were running on the independent thing because Biden was medically unfit or something, then I would vote for Bobo the fucking chimp before I would vote for Donald Trump again. Donald Trump has lost all credibility in my eyes, both with the handling of the pandemic, his inability to respond to crisis, with blaming the states, with the idea that you're not going to help states with Democratic governors because blue states don't deserve your help. Fuck you, Mr. President. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, I absolutely do not, it's unfortunate. But, the real deal here is that I'm looking forward to, I think Biden should pick his running mate right now, and he should pick Kamala Harris. So Kamala Harris has had the benefit of working in law enforcement for most of her career, and she is a woman of color. And I think, first of all, I think the world of Kamala Harris. I think she would make a great vice president. Shouldn't take any shit from anybody. And if something were to happen to President Biden, then I think that Kamala Harris would make a fantastic first African American female president. So, and since she's worked in law enforcement, I think we should call for the total reform of the judicial system, the police force, law enforcement, everything. A bottom up rebuild. And so I think that that is a winning solution. I think that everybody would vote for that. And I just think that it's been inhumane the way that this president has treated uh, millions, tens of millions of people in the U.S. And I just don't think we're going to get any progress with the system the way that it is. I think that we have to have a zero tolerance policy on the part of the police. So this officer who contributed to the death of George Floyd, this officer has killed or contributed to the death of several other people, including multiple shooting victims, traffic accidents that resulted in the deaths of other people. Why is this individual still a police officer? I just think that, it's a pattern of behavior that, I just think you have to ask yourself, why do we allow people that have taken an oath to serve and to protect, who have killed multiple people, people in their custody, people they're chasing, people in a car chase, people in a gunfight, take your pick. So, I just think that it's unforgivable that people are allowed to. So I think you have to do a bottom up rebuild of the entire judicial system, the entire law enforcement sector, and everything else. I think that everybody has to be held to a higher standard, and so that's my opinion. This president, unfortunately, is either unwilling or unable to lead, and he is an ineffective, narcissistic communicator. And so it's all about him and the impact on him and his race. He's not going to be seen photographed with a mask because he doesn't want to be used in a campaign ad. Well, I got news for you, Mr. President. Joe Biden's going to be using his photographs with him in a mask. And how do you think that commercial is going to play out? Mr. President, you neglected to wear a mask. You don't care about the people, in this country, and it's pretty clear. You certainly don't care about the people of color in this community. And I, for one, am appalled that this situation in this year during the pandemic has contributed to the escalation of racial tension, unlike we've seen since 1992 during the LA riots. And Mr. President, that's on you. All this was completely avoidable in so many different ways. I have a minute left on Instagram, and I'm not even going to pitch, hitting my website if you want to schedule a call. Um, I'm not going to use the time that I have remaining. I'm just going to use the time I have to remaining to say that I support all people, especially people of color, and the black community needs to know that everybody should find this completely appalling. And I'm sorry that I won't get a chance to answer any of the comments. I can't believe the hour has gone so quickly, but I appreciate you all joining me. And I think that, it has to be an America where everyone is appreciated and everyone's rights matter. And but right now, the problem is that black lives don't seem to matter to law enforcement. And unfortunately, they don't seem to matter to our politicians either. Black lives do matter. And I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.